Good afternoon. My name is Clare Saxton with the Cancer Support Community. Welcome to our webinar, Frankly Speaking About Cancer, Clinical Trials for Early Stage Cancers, hosted by the Cancer Support Community. If you need technical assistance during the webinar, please dial 1-866-229-3239, option 1. That number is for technical assistance. Before we start, I'll go over some reminders and housekeeping items. If you'd like to listen to today's presentation via telephone, please dial in using the conference line code you see on the screen. Today's call is being recorded and will be available on our website at www.cancersupportcommunity.org/webinars within the next week. The format of today's webinar will be as follows. The panelists will begin the discussion first, and then we will open the discussion up to the audience during the question and answer session. If you would like to ask a question during the question and answer session, please feel free to type it into the Q&A box on the right of your screen. You may submit a question at any time during this event. At the end of this webinar, you will be automatically redirected to the post-webinar survey. Please take a few minutes to complete this survey, as your input is of great value to us. I would now like to introduce the Cancer Support Community, which is the largest professionally led nonprofit network of cancer support worldwide. Cancer Support Community is dedicated to ensuring that all people impacted by cancer are empowered by knowledge, strengthened by action, and sustained by community. We offer the highest quality social and emotional support through our affiliate network, as well as online or over the phone. On this screen, you will see some of the resources we provide at the Cancer Support Community. The first one there is the Cancer Support Helpline, which is staffed by licensed professional counselors who are available to assist you Monday through Friday, 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. Eastern Time. We also have our Open to Options program, which is a research-proven program that can help you prepare a list of questions to share with your doctor. We also have our Frankly Speaking About Cancer program, which is CSC's landmark education series, which provides trusted information on a variety of topics important to people affected by cancer. I would also like to introduce our Cancer Experience Registry, which is a unique project for people affected by cancer. People who have been diagnosed with cancer and those who help care for them can join the registry. You begin by answering survey questions. Your answers and those of others describe the experience of cancer patients and caregivers. This information is used to provide education and support resources that speak to patients, caregivers, and their needs. For more information or to join, visit www.cancerexperienceregistry.org. I would also like to take a moment to talk about our grassroots movement, which helps ensure that people touched by cancer have access to quality, comprehensive cancer care that includes social and emotional support. Again, if you would like to learn more about this program or to sign up, visit our main website at www.cancersupportcommunity.org. I would now like to introduce our panelists, Dr. Brad Hirsch and Mary Clare. Brad Hirsch serves as the Senior Director for Flatiron Health and is a practicing medical oncologist and clinical trialist with Texas Oncology in Dallas. He is also a co-founder and board member at Signal Path Research, a startup leveraging technology to make clinical trials more efficient and effective. Prior to joining Flatiron and Signal Path, he served as Medical Director of Informatics and Health Economics and Outcomes Research for U.S. Oncology, McKesson Specialty Health, and was on the faculty of the Duke Clinical Research Institute. Mary Clare is a mother and leukemia survivor from Chicago. She was diagnosed with high-risk acute myeloid leukemia in August 2014. After chemotherapy and a stem cell transplant, she is cancer-free. She has participated in 2 clinical trials, one being for a vaccine for patients in remission with acute myeloid leukemia and myelodysplastic syndrome. The other clinical trial was for an antiviral drug. She dedicates her time educating patients and their families about clinical trials, female sexual health, and parenting with cancer. I'm now going to ask Dr. Hirsch to give us an overview of clinical trials, then talk to us about why trials are beneficial to those with early-stage cancer diagnoses.
Hi. So please let me know if you can't hear me, but so this is Brad Hirsch, and I am honored to be a part of this. You know, I think that as a researcher, as a doc in the community, as well as somebody who's had family members treated in clinical trials in the past, you know, I think it's a remarkably important topic and one that could use a lot more education in the community. And I see it every day in my patients when I talk about some of the clinical trials that are open at my site in Dallas and talk about some of the broader national movements to get more patients on trial and to make sure that the patient is the right patient for a trial. It's the right fit for them. You know, I think that there's a huge educational need, and so I'm excited that this program exists, that frankly speaking, about cancer clinical trials exists, and that there's the ability to do this today. So I'm going to try to describe clinical trials at a very high level, and happy to dive into any details and give any more background that people are interested in. But you know, at its core, what is a clinical trial? What is the goal of the clinical trials that I do at my site and that many sites around the world do? And the answer to that is that we want to be able to compare what we use now, whatever standard of care is in oncology and cancer, as well as much more broadly, to new treatments that are coming out. And that treatment might be anything from a new medical device, you know, in areas like cardiology, to a new chemotherapy agent in oncology, to a nutritional supplement. You know, there are many, many things. It doesn't just have to be about drugs. And what we use now is generally called standard of care. So if you were seen in my clinic, that would be whatever I would use if you were not in a clinical trial. Sometimes that's a different drug. Sometimes that's just observation. You know, it can be any number of different things compared to whatever it is that's newly coming out, and we're trying to prove whether it works or not and whether it's better when compared to that standard of care. And one of the key things about a clinical trial as a clinician is that I never open a trial on my site that I don't have what's called equipoise around. And that's the idea that I really don't know which is better, that as a doc and as a researcher, you really have to say that you're not convinced that a patient is better either on or off the trial, that, you know, that hopefully it's proving that something even better is out there than what they have today. And so that's why I open very selective trials at my site, and I always encourage patients to participate if they're a good fit, because I've opened it specifically because I think that there might be better options out there to compare to the standard of care. So on the next slide, what you'll see is a discussion around the structure of clinical trials. And I think that it's sort of a black box for a lot of people, and I would argue even for a lot of doctors out there. And so it's great to sort of walk through the different pieces. So as I was just discussing, there are really 2 groups in many trials. So group 1 is the one that receives whatever that standard of care is in the community, whatever it is that people receive in routine care in the same situation. And that's compared to a second group that receives the standard of care with the drug or sometimes just the drug alone. So for example, in some of my prostate cancer patients, it might be that for early stage disease, they get radiation in an attempt to cure them of their prostate cancer. And there's uncertainty that adding a hormonal therapy after radiation might increase the chances of cure. And so generally nothing would be done after radiation, but for some of the patients, if they get on this trial, they very well might receive that additional hormonal therapy. And so the question is, compared to standard of care of not doing anything, of placebo, which isn't a bad thing because that is standard of care and it's what we generally do in the community in that setting, what would it look like in comparison to getting additional hormonal therapies? And so that's the question. Now within that, sometimes patients can be randomized. So in drugs that are farther along in the development process, it might very well be that whatever standard of care is and whatever the treatment on the clinical trial is, we don't really want to know which the patient is receiving, because that can change, that can add biases of how long they stay on it and how I treat that patient. And so sometimes they're randomized between those 2 to take out any biases in who gets which. Sometimes they're also blinded, meaning that I as the doc and the patient wouldn't know which they're receiving, and so we're both blinded to whether they're on the experimental arm or the standard of care arm, and sometimes there's a placebo involved, meaning, and placebo, to many people means sugar pill, which often it is, but it's only given in situations where the standard of care would otherwise to be do nothing in that setting. Sometimes instead it's randomized and blinded against whatever the standard chemotherapy is in that setting. So again, there's the standard of care arm generally, then there's the experimental arm, and within those, sometimes patients are randomized, but not always, and we'll talk in the next slide a little bit more about the different clinical trial settings and the different phases of trials and how people move across those, and sometimes we're blinded so we don't know who's getting what. On the next slide, you'll see these different phases. So a phase 1 trial is often the first time that a given drug is used or device or whatever it is that is being tested is used in humans or in a specific disease. And so the goal here is not to figure out if the drug works. It's often just to figure out how safe the drug is to be given and what the right dose to give that drug is. So it might very well be that we start out, it's the first time that this drug has ever been used in humans, and so it started out at a very low dose, and then to make sure patients can tolerate it well, and then the dose is increased until we reach what we think is the right place at which it's tolerable, but has the highest potential to impact and to really have negative or positive things happen, avoiding any negative side effects that would be too detrimental in further trials. Sometimes we see signals of something working or not working, but that's not the goal of these phase 1 trials. It's really just a safety trial. But for some of the most promising new things, that's where they all started at phase 1 trial. Many of the things that everybody's receiving today at one point or another were in these early phase trials. And so it's a critical step and often is the first time that people see some of the agents that will ultimately become sort of standard of care and really change our practice. So if the right dose is found and the drug is felt to be safe, then it moves on to phase 2. And in a phase 2 trial, whatever that dose is that was found, that is sort of what we call the maximum tolerated dose, that right exchange between being tolerable, but also being at a high enough dose to potentially be effective, that's what often moves forward into the phase 2 trials. Now, in the phase 2 setting, we're looking at both safety. So now that we've decided the right dose, the safe dose, we give it to more patients and we make sure that there are no problems with it. There's nothing that would be concerning that would cause us to change the dosing or reconsider things, as well as seeing if it works, if it's efficacious. So efficacy just means, does it work better compared to whatever it is that we're comparing it to? And so phase 2 trials are often smaller. They're not always randomized and they don't always have 2 arms. Still here it might be that everybody on the trial is getting the drug, everybody knows they're getting the drug and the dose that they're getting the experimental agent at, but we can really look and make sure it's safe and efficacious. Sometimes that's all it takes. Sometimes for rare diseases or really dramatic benefit, even after a phase 2 trial, it could go in front of the FDA or other bodies. Often, though, the next step is once there is some signal that it's working and that it's helpful, as well as that it's safe and that it makes sense, then a company will push it through into phase 3 trials. In a phase 3 trial, in other areas like cardiology, it could be thousands, even tens of thousands of patients. In oncology, it's generally smaller just because of the nature of what we're studying. But these are often randomized trials. They often have 2 arms, so whatever that standard of care is versus whatever the experimental agent is. Often randomized, often blinded, meaning neither the patient or the doc knows which arm a given patient is on, sometimes against placebo, depending on what the standard of care is in the community. But this is often when we get, big publications that everybody's talking about and really change care, often they come in the phase 3 setting because those are really the robust trials to sort of give the final proof that something is really truly beneficial against whatever the standard is. But and this process, phase 1, 2, and phase 3 can take years, can take a decade in a lot of cases. And so, from the time that a new promising agent is first in a phase 1 trial to the time it ultimately makes it to the FDA after a phase 3 trial can be a very long time. And especially for really exciting new classes of drugs, which we can talk about today if folks are interested, it's critically important to get access to those drugs earlier, just because there's so much opportunity to really impact care and to really improve how patients do. So on the next slide. So one of the logical questions is, what are we looking for in these trials? How do we know if something is working or not, particularly in these phase 2 and phase 3 settings when I'm talking about efficacy or whether there's an impact? So in an ideal world, trials are evaluating overall survival. So overall survival is exactly what it sounds like. It's do patients on the new treatment, whatever the experimental arm is here, do they live longer than those on the standard of care or whatever's traditionally done in clinic? In an ideal world, every drug that gets approved would have overall survival clearly. And not only that there would be a statistically significant difference in overall survival, but a clinically meaningful one as well. And that can mean a lot of different things. So specifically talking about early stage cancers like we're talking about today, though, that can be complex because often, continuing with the prostate cancer example, somebody with early stage prostate cancer with a curative intent might very well, my hope is that they'll live for many, many years. And so a drug that improves survival might be improving something that happens a decade from now. And so sometimes we look at other sort of what we call surrogates, so something that might predict a benefit of survival, but might allow us not to wait a decade or however long it might be to really be able to show that outcome. And examples of that, so progression-free survival. So this really it's exactly like it sounds like. It's how long does it take for the time treatment starts until the cancer begins to grow again. So how long is that disease controlled? And that's the progression-free survival. In some areas, that's been directly shown to correlate or be related to how long people survive overall. In some areas, the relationship there isn't quite as strong. But often when you are talking about clinical trials, and especially in oncology, and when you look at the research that's out there, a lot of times people refer to this PFS, or progression-free survival, about how long before the disease grows. Another is disease-free survival. So in folks that might have no evidence of cancer, again, taking the prostate cancer example just to follow it through, if they get surgery or radiation and there's no evidence of cancer anywhere else, and then they get something else, this experimental therapy, the question is how long does it take before there is evidence that the cancer has come back or that it has spread? And so that's the disease-free interval as opposed to progression-free survival, which is the time at which we know there's disease, but the time it takes for it to get bigger or spread. Another, often in blood cancers and other areas, a lot of times we can see complete remissions. And so another question is how often does the treatment result in the complete disappearance of the disease, of the cancer? And so these are just a couple of examples of what we look at in these trials. So, ideally for trials, they're powered, these big phase 3 trials looking at 1,000 patients or, sometimes much smaller than that, sometimes bigger than that. Hopefully we see that it extends survival. Often in oncology, 3, 4, 6 month survival benefits are seen by a lot of the drugs out there that have been approved. But also, other things that you'll see are progression, disease-free survival, complete remission, as well as things like quality of life metrics and things that hopefully are very meaningful to patients. So that's how we look at the success of these trials. On the next slide, another logical question is, so let's say you're a patient and you're seeing a urologist and talking about what kind of intervention, or you're seeing a breast surgeon and you're talking about, after the surgery, what should I do? And they say, well, there's this trial that's available looking at, it's a phase 3 trial looking at the use of a given experimental drug that hasn't yet been approved to see if it can decrease the time to recurrence or even prevent recurrence altogether and hopefully impact overall survival. One of the next logical questions is, how are patients selected? How do I know if I can be a part of that trial? And there are a couple of key things that are really important to look at. So, and these are sort of grouped together into what are called eligibility criteria, which, exactly like it sounds like, tells us who's eligible for a given trial. So this is usually broken down to inclusion criteria and exclusion criteria. So inclusion criteria really tells you who the study is looking for. So they are factors that allow a person to participate. So just following through the prostate cancer example, so it might be that we want patients with very small initial disease who got radiation to that area over the course of a given number of weeks, who also, there can be a whole bunch of different factors, who have never received any hormonal therapies prior and don't have any other concomitant issues related to it. So, and those are the inclusion criteria to tell us the patient population that should be considered for the trial. Similarly, there are exclusion criteria, meaning that there are there are patient populations that, for a variety of different reasons, are not eligible to take part, or that prevent participation. And that can be everything from a patient having HIV to a patient that doesn't have kidney function that's working, the kidneys that are working quite right, or a patient that's pregnant, there are often a number of exclusion criteria as well. One of the big discussions that's going on in the clinical trial community right now, in the research community, is the fact that there are often too many inclusion and exclusion criteria. I was actually just reviewing a paper this morning about this. There was a kidney cancer paper that I wrote a couple of years ago with some folks that looked at the drugs that patients were receiving for the treatment of their kidney cancer and looking back at the trials. And what we found is that over 40% of patients that were receiving those drugs in the community wouldn't have qualified for the trials on which the treatment was based. Which is obviously a fundamental problem, and that's a product of the inclusion and exclusion criteria that we use today, and that they're overly stringent. And so it's really important to know that, before you get your hopes up and are far along into the process of considering a given trial, what kind of inclusion and exclusion criteria are required for that trial and whether you would qualify. But so that's sort of the background there. On the next slide, you'll see that we're talking about why most trials are done for late stage or metastatic disease. So I know today we're talking about this early stage area, and it is a frustration for many that so much of our focus is later on in the disease course. Part of it is that there just need to be better options for those patients. Often in the curative setting or in the early stage setting, there are a lot of options out there. A lot of times patients, can balk at the toxicity of different therapies, whereas later on, often it's a last-ditch effort to really figure out what's available and what can be done. And so a lot of times that's where the drug development has been focused in the past. But there's a need to offer effective known therapies where they exist, meaning that a lot of times the experimental drugs happen in later lines of therapy for people that have failed multiple drugs. And those move up over time. And so sometimes the first time you see somebody with early stage disease, you already know something that works very, very well. And so something has to have been studied for a while before it can be applied to that setting, just because we wouldn't want to take chances. And that gets back to this point of really having equipoise, of really not knowing as a clinician which is the right drug, or if the experimental is better than the supportive care or whatever the standard of care is. And so, and then new therapies are always being compared against the standard of care. Often in later lines and then moved up, like I said. And so I think that I've seen the frustration in early stage disease that there aren't more things out there. There aren't more trials out there, but I think that's changing a lot, especially after a lot of the new and promising agents in oncology have been studied in the more advanced settings. So agents, and we can talk about any of this later, but agents like immunotherapies and things that people are very excited about, I see more and more being tested in this early stage setting. When I think about prostate cancer in particular, as the example I'm giving, a decade ago when we had almost no therapies for patients with advanced disease, a lot of the focus in drug development was in much later stage disease. Now that there are, I haven't looked at the numbers in a while, I think there are 8 new therapies in the last 7 to 10 years in prostate cancer. Now that a lot of those have been studied in the more advanced or late stage setting, a lot of them are moving up to much earlier in the disease course, which is exciting and hopefully has a lot of implications for the topic today. On the next slide. So, and another logical question is, how do patients benefit from trials? Clearly, there's the possible therapeutic benefit, and that's why so many people choose to be on these trials. So Keytruda is an example of the immunotherapy that I was just talking about. So Keytruda is the drug that Jimmy Carter got for melanoma, and so a lot of people know it well from that setting. And the trial in breast cancer, and triple-negative breast cancer, meaning that the hormone receptors are negative, and we decide breast cancer treatments based on hormone receptor status often. They found a 20% response rate in people who tried other therapies, and that used to be unheard of, that this idea that people that had failed numerous therapies would still get that kind of a response rate. And not only was there a response rate, but some of the folks that respond to these new immunotherapies can have very long durations of response. Which is very, very exciting. And we've seen in kidney cancer and melanoma and breast cancer. And like I was talking about earlier, a lot of this is now moving further and further up in the disease course. And that's the next bullet point. The melanoma and lung trials have also seen similar responses in kidney cancer as well. And it's a great example of where we're going with precision medicine. We're going to come back to this in a few minutes, but the hope is to be able to understand biomarkers and better select who should get a given drug, so that we make sure that we're really targeting the key needs of patients and in the early setting as well as later settings. CAR T trials with acute lymphocytic leukemia and chronic lymphocytic leukemia, or CLL, is another example of something that, we're trying to figure out the right dosing and the right approaches, but is also another very exciting area moving forward. Another reason that patients consider trials, and I think get significant benefit, is the degree of care and monitoring. So, at my site, we have a whole clinical research staff that just takes care of our clinical research patients, because as we've moved to more and more complex trials, it takes more and more sort of day-to-day care to help patients out. And often as a part of these trials, patients are seen very consistently in our clinic. Patients that might go 3 or 4 months without being seen have the opportunity to see much more frequently, and people on call to answer all their questions. And so I think that this level of care within clinical trials is excellent. And so it's another, not that hopefully no care outside of clinical trials is substandard, but a lot of people looking after you and a lot of potential benefit there. And the last and very important, regardless, is the contribution to knowledge. So everything that I use in my clinic today, at some point or another, has been tested in a clinical trial setting. What that means has evolved a lot over the last couple of decades, but somebody was always the first person to get it. And for some of the really promising and fantastic drugs in these diseases that have been approved, the patients on the clinical trials got them much earlier. And so I think that there's a huge potential for therapeutic benefit by getting these agents before they make it to the market, before they're FDA approved. The quality of care within these trials is excellent, and the contribution of knowledge is also one of the key outcomes of it. On the next page here, on the next slide, so specifically the trials for early stage cancer, the question is, first, why is it important to understand who is at risk for recurrence, right? A lot of what we try to do with these trials is better stratify who gets a given drug, who's going to be at the highest risk of recurrence, and that's something that as a patient is important to know, because using, testicular cancer as an example, there are some times when it's early stage disease that's found that the risk of recurrence is very, very low. There are some where there are prognostic factors that make that risk of recurrence much higher, and in that setting, it might make a great deal more sense to be on a clinical trial that's answering some question and trying to keep the disease away. And so there is an element of education for patients around, risk and prognosis and what choices they should then make. It's important to understand how patients are selected for these trials. We went through the inclusion and exclusion criteria. One of the things that I still struggle with, and I work for a couple of different technology companies presently that have Google and Roche and a lot of big backing. And one of the things that we are trying to deal with is the idea that, even for docs, it can be very hard to figure out what patient should be on a given trial, how to find that trial. I have a research center within the hospital that I work at that I can't even understand what their trials are offering. And so there are a lot of efforts ongoing to better identify, to make it easier for patients as well as clinicians to figure out what the right trials are, and to very early on figure out who should be selected for those trials. We at Flatiron Health, as well as folks at Watson and a number of different places, are all trying to help do matching programs for patients as well, so to help really educate patients about what their options are out there. One of the other important questions about early stage trials is, what is the difference between an adjuvant and a neoadjuvant trial, because there are a lot of questions about those and a lot of trials that use that terminology. And so for early stage cancers, often there's the opportunity to have surgery to remove the disease. In that setting, sometimes there's treatment that's given before to try to shrink the disease and maximize the chance of getting rid of it at surgery, and sometimes there's some kind of treatment that's given after to try to maximize the chance that there's no cancer left after the surgery. So if it's given before surgery, it's called neoadjuvant. If it's given after surgery, it's called adjuvant. Sometimes it's only, in these clinical trials, something's only given neoadjuvantly, so before you even go to surgery, you need to think about whether there's an option for treatment. In some settings, some kind of treatment is only given adjuvantly, meaning go through the surgery and then see if you qualify for that clinical trial. But either way, you need to know before really moving down the treatment course, if you're at a high risk of recurrence or you have concerns or there are trials that are relevant. That's a conversation that needs to happen in the beginning to make sure that you're well positioned. I should also say that there are some therapies that are given both neoadjuvantly and adjuvantly, with anal cancer being an example of, even outside of clinical trials, that we often treat, we give something before surgery neoadjuvantly, we do surgery, and then we give something else after adjuvantly. And sometimes that's in combination with radiation and other therapies. So the advantage to patients we talked about a second ago, there are personal benefits of improved outcomes. There are societal benefits of moving the needle forward, as well as personal benefits of hopefully the highest quality care. One of the things that we're looking at in early stage cancers a lot is this idea of biomarkers. It's something that ever since, over a decade ago, we started looking at genomics in greater depth. We've worked tirelessly, honestly, to try to figure out how to decide who's at highest risk for occurrence. And there are a lot of different ways to think about that. There's everything from blood tests to look if there are what we call circulating cancer cells or circulating tumor cells that might show some residual cells, to different imaging that could show residual cells, to different genomic signatures that might show high risk. There are a lot of different trials that are even looking at those types of things. And then, are they predictive of response to certain therapies? And so it's a complex space. It's an exciting one. Here at Flatiron, we work a lot with Foundation Medicine, and one of the things we've done is matched up large data sets to try to start answering those questions, so that we don't have to start with these trials, that hopefully we can use what's happening in clinical practice to bring us a long way along that continuum, and then open up these early stage trials and other trials for sort of the right patient population, instead of doing a lot of those experiments early on. And so it's interesting to watch how these things are accelerating, and some of these topics have been coming up with the Moonshot program that Vice President Biden was discussing yesterday. And case histories is the last point. Specific trials or patients. There are a lot of sort of anecdotal evidence, as well as evidence that folks like us at Flatiron and elsewhere are starting to put together to really understand the disease course, and to be able to tell patients about that, and to better target trials to patients and help patients understand which trials are right for them. And so it's an exciting time to work through a lot of these. On the next slide. So, and I touched on this briefly earlier, but it is a very important point that clinical trials often do improve quality of life. So it's not only, patients are always concerned about being guinea pigs, which is absolutely, a valid concern and a logical concern. If there's true equipoise by the doc, uncertainty about which is the right drug, then, hopefully it's really answering an important question, and we truly believe that patients can benefit from it, which, I know in all the docs that I work with that exists who are opening these trials. But not only is it in terms of survival and progression, but it's also in terms of quality of life. So it might change the amount of treatment needed for a specific group of patients, and that might be because, in the early stage setting, by getting a couple extra weeks of therapy, we prevent recurrence later on. It might be because a new approach, and some of these things even can study less therapy. So instead of getting 6 months of the therapy, you might be looking at 3 months of the therapy. It might be that some of these clinical trials either are studying or recommending health interventions, things like exercise and nutrition. Being part of some of these trials can provide a lot of benefit. And then a point that's not on here, I think, that's also important, is that some of the treatments themselves can also improve quality of life. So not only does it prolong life or delay progression, but also by getting a response with some of these agents, we can really help people to feel better and get them quick relief. Not always the case, because of course there's toxicity to some of these agents, but definitely part of the equation. On the next slide. So what's next? And this means everything from the clinical trial side of things to the early stage disease side of things. It's been a fascinating last 6 to 12 months in the clinical research space. I truly believe that there are going to be new models of how cancer clinical trials are done over the next couple of years, and we're already starting to see them. And it's thanks to a lot of different things, some FDA legislation that's come out, some very strong support groups like CSC and others, as well as Vice President Biden's Cancer Moonshot, and just a number of things. There's a large push to integration of clinical trials into community practice in a way that it hasn't existed previously. It used to be that a lot of these trials were only at large academic centers, and they were very sort of rigorous in how they did it in terms of who can be on it and who couldn't, and exactly how many times do you have to come in, and what's that going to cost you from travel and things like that. And that's fundamentally changing. So we have more and more trials in the community, like my own site, as well as a lot of the sites that we support. What we're seeing is that a lot of the trials are trying to be more reflective of what happens in community practice, so that instead of what I said earlier, where 40% of the patients I treat with kidney cancer drugs who've never been on the trials, that support their treatment, those trials are hopefully going to start reflecting practice much more. They're also going to be cheaper and quicker and easier because a lot of it's going to be corrected in routine practice. So instead of having a whole bunch of different systems and all sorts of research staff, we'll use our electronic health records now that there's so much technology in the community to start supporting these trials. We'll start looking at adverse events and the things that happen in real time based on different patient-reported outcomes that patients are giving us directly, or sensors that patients are wearing. There's going to be a very different model of what clinical research is over the next couple of years. There will always be the phase 1 and phase 2 and sort of traditional approach there, because the first time a drug is in a patient or given to a patient, you have to very a great deal of infrastructure, and only certain sites can do those well. As well as a lot of oversight. But I think that as we get further along in the development process, a lot more of it is going to happen in routine practice. A lot more of it's going to be supported in the background and will ultimately be a lot easier on patients and hopefully enable us to answer questions much more quickly. And also answer questions that aren't going to be paid for as randomized trials. So many of our trials are either pharma-funded or funded by sort of large consortiums, that it's very tough, as expensive as those processes are, to answer some of the questions that are important, head-to-head comparisons of different drugs on the market and the like. And so I think that'll happen increasingly with these new models. The exciting thing is also, as I was discussing earlier, that there are a lot more effective therapies out there, even over the last couple of years or even couple of months. I mean, things are changing so quickly in oncology. It's fantastic. And I think a lot of those drugs are going to move further and further towards the early stage setting now that they've been well studied elsewhere, and have a real opportunity for impact in all the different places that we were talking about, whether survival or progression, recurrence, response, and quality of life. And another key thing that I haven't touched on is that we need a great deal more patient involvement in trial design and evaluation. It's been discussed for a long time, but similar to some of the changes in clinical trial infrastructure I was just talking about, I think that we're seeing a lot more patient involvement in trial design and evaluation. So, Friends of Cancer Research, CSC, there are a lot of these groups out there that are really doing a great job of pushing for patients to be at the table and make sure that it's the right question being asked, make sure that the trial conduct is in the right way, the right patients are eligible, and the right endpoints are being followed, things like patient symptoms as reported by the patient, what we call patient-reported outcomes. And so, again, I think it's an exciting time. And I think that as we're able to understand risk of disease based on the different things I was talking about, whether biomarkers or circulating tumor cells or any number of different predictors, we're going to better understand who's at high risk and be able to study what works and what doesn't to decrease that risk much more effectively. One of the many things that's changing now. And then quality of life and well-being. I think that as we change some of the infrastructure around the trials to make them easier to participate in, as well as some of these new drugs come into the market, that there's a huge opportunity for really impacting what it's like to participate in a trial. But I think it's an exciting time and a huge opportunity. And again, I think that's the last slide that I had. Did I have one more after that one? Yeah, so before I hand it over, I'm sure that there will be questions in a second, but just to reiterate, I think that it's extraordinarily important for folks to know what trials are available to them. I would hate for patients to miss the opportunity to participate in a trial either because they don't understand enough about what the clinical trial infrastructure looks like and what it means to participate, or because even like it is for me, it's hard to identify where a trial is. And so I think that technology, both sort of patient-facing as well as in clinics, will make it much, much easier to understand what trials are available and really empower both the docs and the patients to give these opportunities. And my hope is also that there are a lot of educational opportunities like this program, the Frankly Speaking program, that really starts to inform people, because I think it's an exciting time, whether early stage of disease or otherwise. So I'll hand it over to Mary Clare at this point.
Oh, thank you so much, Brad. I'm Mary Clare Bietila, and I am a leukemia survivor. Let's see. So I was diagnosed in August 2014 with high-risk AML leukemia, which is a blood cancer. Acute myeloid leukemia is the non-abbreviated. So I had been experiencing fatigue and migraines for the summer of 2014 and thought that it was just stress related to working too much and being a mom of a young child and just a hectic overall lifestyle. it started with a lot of dizziness and a headache that wrapped around the back of my head and lasted for 3 days, and I went to urgent care. They did not like the look of me and sent me for blood tests, which quickly came back that there was something going on here that looked like, blood mutations or blood cancer. And excuse me if I misspeak. I am not a doctor. I am an educator in the realm of the arts. So this has all my knowledge has come through being a patient. So I'm looking forward to sharing my experience with those that are listening today, and hopefully it will be of service to you. So there are no stages for liquid cancers, for blood cancers. So I was immediately changed my location from my house with my family over to the hospital and stayed there for the next 6 weeks, where I received the standard of care, which was induction chemo with high-dose cytarabine and daunorubicin. And so I had about 1 week of chemo after all the genetic makeup was factored in, and then I had 5 weeks for my counts to recover enough so that I could go back in the outside world. The high-dose chemo really impacted my immune system, so I was quite vulnerable. So I needed to stay hospitalized until my blood counts recovered enough to go back into the real world. And so I was successful in getting through inpatient induction chemo, and quickly through my oncologist and her whole team looking at my genetic makeup, the best chance for survival for me was not continuing chemo, just because the way that AML leukemia works is that it's difficult for most patients to stay in remission with just chemo alone. So I was a candidate for a stem cell transplant and was lucky enough to find a match through Be the Match. And I continued to have chemo up until my transplant in November of 2014. I had an allogenic stem cell transplant, and an anonymous donor gave me his stem cells, and I basically rebooted my immune system with a brand new one and new cells. And I have been in remission since September 2014. I did have complications throughout my treatment, but the majority of my treatment was standard of care. I did not begin with clinical trials until remission. And the first clinical trial that let's see, can you move to the next? Thank you. So my first clinical trial experience was in the winter of 2015, and it was the WT1 study. WT stands for Willis tumor. And it is, in layman's terms, a vaccination against a specific genotype related to my cancer. It's a peptide, I believe is the term. And so I had a series of about 40 injections over a 6-month period that vaccinated me against recurrence. I had been asking my doctor and her team, what clinical trials were available, what other treatments should I be looking at, and this, as well as another trial, were presented, and I trusted my doctor to really help me make that decision with some research. This was a stage 2 trial, and it was a really great experience as far as the amount of care and treatment I received after going through very intensive therapies for the months prior. I really myself psychologically was not ready to be kind of released back into the real world, and it was surprisingly comforting and supportive to, on a weekly and regular basis, continue going to the clinic, continue seeing my oncologist, and receiving additional treatment and care. I did spend lengthy amounts of time in clinic, which I understand would not be of interest to that many people, but it could save your life. So it could be a really wonderful thing. For me, it was really great to kind of have that bridge back to normalcy through these injections. So I had about 2 injections a week, and then it turned to once a week, and then monthly, and then every other month. And then I had multiple injections each time. They were like gigantic vaccines is the best way I can put it, but I would have to go to the clinic, and once I was there, because it's quite a costly therapy, though I paid nothing, the pharmaceutical company, which underwrote everything, required that I be in clinic, checked in a room before the vaccine itself would be made at the pharmacy at the hospital. So I did wait upwards of 2 to 3 hours at times for the shots. But I did, based on the research that I had reviewed and based on what my oncologist had told me, it was a really, really great option and truly what I believe is the future of cancer research and cancer therapies does have a lot to do with mapping of genotypes and looking at vaccinating for recurrence. Or, the hope is that this kind of therapy, specifically the WT1, would be a great option for older people or folks who are not healthy enough to get a stem cell transplant. It was looked at, in my case, differently, but my understanding is it's been looked at with other patients in that regard. Can you move to the next slide, please? Thanks. So the other clinical trial I experienced was very different. As many stem cell transplant recipients experience, I had CMV, which is cytomegalovirus, reactivate when my transplant happened. And CMV is something that is in most folks, and it's a dormant virus that you would never know you had. Only when the immune system is disrupted in this kind of way can it reactivate. And for folks with compromised immune systems, as I was, it can be dangerous. So the typical therapy for that is a lot of antiviral drugs, but they've recently found another use for what they call the Ebola drug, CMX-001, is great for combating CMV. So I was enrolled in that particular study, and I was in the control group. So I did receive a placebo, which completely changed after the first couple of days because my CMV was not under control at all, and it was clear that I needed to move over to the standard of care, which are some really gigantic pills. So everyone knew that I was not actually getting this particular trial. My understanding is it's a great drug and it works well. I didn't receive it, but what I can say is even being in the control group, I was in touch with a really wonderful group of doctors that were tracking me throughout my transplant time. Still to this day, I received a call last week with this particular infectious disease doctor's team calling me and saying, how are you doing and tracking me. It was just wonderful to have folks that were also looking and helping me kind of navigate through these systems as well. And that was a really, really great thing. I received wonderful extra care from doctors, and oftentimes it was this particular trial, these folks would just piggyback on my regular doctor's visits. So there was no additional time going to the clinic or the hospital. There was really not much additional beyond, each time I came, there was 5 questions they had me answer on an iPad, and that was about it. At one point in time, they did do a home visit, which blew my mind. I was ill at that point in time and bedridden, and they said, we'll just come to you. And so I was just very impressed by the amount of care I received, and it felt really good to be giving back as well. Next slide. Oh, so that's me, and that's about all I've got for you guys. Shall we move it over to Q&A?
Great. So we would like now to open up the discussion to the audience. We may have answered some of your questions during the presentation. However, if you have any additional questions, please feel free to type them into the question and answer box to the right of your screen. So we'll take one moment to wait for questions. And while we're giving just one more minute for folks to ask questions, I'm going to ask Dr. Hirsch if he doesn't mind talking just a little bit more about, since this is a webinar on early stage clinical trials, does he have any idea of when looking at immunotherapy in earlier stage cancers might be, what the timeline might be for looking at the immunotherapies that are being so promising in late stage cancers? When might researchers start looking at those in earlier stage cancers? And Dr. Hirsch, if you're talking, you have your mute on.
Sorry about that. There are too many places to mute between the phone and the computer. It's a great question, and there are definitely immunotherapy trials already in early stage disease. So in bladder cancer is one that, we have one where after surgery for potentially hopefully curative disease in bladder cancer, atezolizumab or Tecentriq, which is the Roche immunotherapy similar to Opdivo that many folks see commercials for all the time, and pembrolizumab or Keytruda that Jimmy Carter got. So I've already seen it in bladder cancer. I know that there are a number of others as well, and so we're already seeing the readout of the first-line trials for more advanced disease, meaning the first time that patients with advanced disease get any kind of therapy. That there's a lot of new trials being sort of published and released. I think the next wave will happen in a lot of early stage disease, and those trials are ongoing. So, for instance, with one of my patients recently who had high-risk bladder cancer, who had surgery, and the hope was that they were cured, I had to tell them, there was no clear evidence of anything else that I could do, but that there was a clinical trial at one of the other sites in Dallas, not my own, where they were studying the Tecentriq, and they ultimately went over. They decided not to participate in the trial, but that those trials are ongoing. So folks that are in that space should absolutely look to see it's very disease specific and location specific, but should absolutely look to see what trials are available.
Thank you, Dr. Hirsch. Since I haven't received any additional questions, before we close, Mary Claire, do you have any closing thoughts that you want to share with people listening to this webinar?
Sure thing. So what was very helpful to me and my research was to treat being a cancer patient as my job. So I needed to understand the lingo and really figure out that landscape. Gilda's Club and my social worker were really excellent and helpful as far as navigating many aspects, but being treated at the University of Chicago, my oncologist and that entire transplant team came with a patient educator, and I utilized her at every stretch of the way. So we were inundated with materials, and that could be too much at times. So, it was a balancing act to figure out, how do we move forward with this? How do we make good decisions? And how do we stay informed? So I think, knowing your resources, utilizing those resources is key, but at the same time having profound trust in your oncologist to help you navigate through that. And if you don't feel like you're getting the answers that you need, asking to work with another oncologist or getting a second opinion. I think that if you're at a research institution, you're very well positioned to be working with a team of doctors who are at the, have the ability to find out what's out there and what treatments might be good for you beyond the standard of care. And I think in this day and age, it's a patient's responsibility to push and to make themselves available. I often see many patients just saying no to anything additional than the standard of care. And I think in this day and age, there's really good ethics at play that protect patients, and it's a really good point to be active and involved and to advocate for yourself.
Thank you, Mary Clare. Dr. Hirsch, do you have anything you want to say as we close the webinar?
I think Mary Clare's point was great, that so much of it is about being activated and being supported, and whether that's in academics or community practice, I think that there is a huge opportunity to understand your disease, do your research, figure out where the right trials are, figure out who the best docs are. I think that and that the change in what's available to patients in the community in terms of technology-based stuff, in terms of what's on the internet to understand trials, in terms of the work that CSC and others are doing, I think that there's a huge opportunity to really educate oneself. And I hope that, the discussion today gives some framework around what the different terms mean and the importance of understanding what phase a trial is, in case that's something important to you, understanding inclusion and exclusion criteria. Another important thing we didn't talk about earlier, but is a consistent issue, is whether a given insurance company is going to cover what's on that trial. And so more and more frequent they are, and there are ways to advocate to make sure that happens. But there are a lot of pieces, and don't think that just because it's early stage disease or that you're with a surgeon and they say there's nothing else to worry about, that there aren't opportunities to really look out for what those trials are, to talk to the right folks, and to hopefully move the needle, to advance the science as well as potentially help yourself. And so it can be pretty powerful. And the degree to which I can ever be helpful, folks, I'm sure that my contact information is somewhere here, and I'm happy to help in whatever that looks like.
Well, thank you both. We've had wonderful panelists today. Both Dr. Hirsch and Mary Clare contributed their time and shared this important information with us, and we very much appreciate that. Thanks for everyone for listening to this webinar on clinical trials for early-stage cancers. If you would like more information, please visit the CSC website or call our toll-free helpline. We also want to let you know about our upcoming October 24th webinar, Frankly Speaking About Cancer, Clinical Trials and Immunotherapy. For information about this or any other webinar, visit www.cancersupportcommunity.org/webinars. CSC would also like to thank our program supporters, Amgen, Celgene, AztraZeneca, Karyopharm, Pfizer, and Novartis. Please take a moment to complete our webinar evaluation survey, which you will be automatically redirected to. We greatly appreciate any feedback you may have. Thanks again for your participation.